Cool. Hi everybody, welcome to our off-site anatomy lab. We're going to do the spinal cord today, as well as some spinal nerve info and a little bit about the autonomic nervous system. So I'm just kind of going to run through the exercise sheet. We have two models that we're going to primarily show you. The first one, this is a live cadaver spinal cord that I'm going to go through. And then we also have a classic model that would have been sitting on your tables that will kind of show the info in more detail. So we'll go over both of those. So let's get started. This is a cadaver spinal cord. It's pretty rad. First things first, we can see some outside features of the spinal cord, particularly this flap right here that has been dissected open is a protective outer coating of the spinal cord called the dura mater. There's another sort of protective layer, which we would call the arachnoid matter. That would be underneath the dura. You can't see it on the spinal cord. It ends up being something that doesn't preserve well. But we can sort of get a good idea about the third protective layer. That's called the pia mater. The pia mater would sort of sit directly on the spinal cord itself. When we zoom in, you can kind of see some blackish material on the spinal cord that's like dried blood vessels that would actually have been part of the pia mater. So those are our three protective layers. Those together are known as the meninges. After that, I'm going to orient you on this nice spinal cord here. So this would be our top area of the spinal cord, and then down here would sort of be our lumbar region. So this is going to be down sort of at the end of your spine here. Interesting things, if we're going in order on your exercise sheet, at the end here of the spinal cord, we see this sort of cone area. It kind of comes to a terminal point at the end. It's cone shaped. This is called our conus medullaris. That conus medullaris continues on in something called the filum terminale, or in Latin, the last filament. Take that for what you will. Besides that last filament, if we kind of pull out that filum terminale, the rest of these kind of hair-like matters coming off the spinal column are called cauda equina. So I talked about this outer layer being our dura mater. That's held together onto the spinal column itself by something called denticulate ligaments. Literally tiny little ligaments that are keeping this connected to the spinal cord. You can see them if you pull back the spinal cord itself and you look for these little tiny ligaments holding onto the dura mater. We have some enlarged areas on the spinal cord. These are going to give rise to what are called our plexuses. The whole back sheet of your page is talking about plexuses. It's a fancy word for a grouping of sort of nerves that are going to come off of our spinal cord and go to basically our appendages. So we have sort of an enlargement up in our cervical area, we have a thoracic enlargement, and then down in our lumbar area we have a lumbar enlargement, and these things would go off to form plexi. So for brachial plexus, for example, is going to go off into our arms, and we have a lumbar plexus, it's going to go off into our lower body region and our legs. How we branch off into those sort of plexi and what happens from our spinal cord going out is we sort of have these divisions that we call names. Primarily what we're looking at is coming right off of the spinal cord. We have something that are called roots. We have a dorsal root and we have a anterior root. Sometimes we use the terms ventral and dorsal and posterior and anterior sort of interchangeably. You'll see on your exercises that they're used interchangeably. But what happens is we have that little split into different roots. You can see them on a couple of our areas on the brachial plexus of the real spinal cord. Let's find where a good one's actually. Here's a good one. So we can see here that we have a smaller sort of root coming off of the spinal cord. That would be our anterior or ventral. And then we have this larger one called a dorsal root ganglion. A ganglion is just sort of an enlarged area of those sort of nerves coming off the spinal column as well as cells. So we can see that we actually have that division there. We'll see that better on the actual model. I'll point that out on the model. What else? Also what we can't see on there, after we have split into the dorsal sort of roots, we have another division and we call that into rami, which I'll point out on the model because we don't have those dissected here on the cadaver model. One cool thing we can see is if you take the spinal column itself and you do a transection of it, we can see some pretty cool features. This will be great in our close-up shot and also on the model. So sort of the division of the spinal column, we end up getting what's called gray matter and white matter. And so that gray matter ends up forming horns. You'll see when we do a close-up, it literally looks like, I think, a butterfly, but they're called horns. And so we end up with these different shapes. That's one way that we can tell our dorsal side from our ventral side is by the shape of those horns, which I'll point out more in the model. But if you're looking at the cross-section here, you can actually see those different shapes. Other things that we can see, I'm gonna probably point out and leave for the model because we can't really see them on the cadaver. All right, part 2, we're gonna look at a close-up of the spinal cord. So to orient you, what we're looking at here is we're pretending that our spinal column is sort of gonna continue like this. So we're looking at what my spinal column would be if you just cut that up in half. So here's that nice cross-section, which was kind of hard to see the shape in the real cadaver. But what we're looking at here is this outside material is known as white matter. And then what's blue in here is obviously the gray matter. Clearly I should make models for a living. Anyways, so if we're looking at the shape of that gray model, here's that nice butterfly shape again. This is one of the primary ways we're gonna tell anterior from posterior. So listen up, kids. If you're looking at the anterior side, the shape of these wings here are gonna be broader, less pointy, kind of more wide. Okay, so this would tell us that this side is anterior. The dorsal side, or the dorsal horns, are gonna be pointier and kind of elongated. So that would tell me that this is the dorsal side. A couple other ways to tell. If you're looking at the spinal column as a whole right here, there's a division in half of that area, this whole spinal column, and that also is gonna help us tell anterior from posterior. On the anterior side, this division is more noticeable. It's a bigger space between the two halves, so we call it a fissure. So this is our anterior or ventral median fissure. On the posterior side, that division is a little bit less noticeable, so we don't call it a fissure, we're just gonna call it something called a sulcus. So this is our posterior median sulcus. Less noticeable, but also helps orient front from back. The other things we can look at here on the shape, between the two halves of the wing, we have this common gray area, seen in blue, called the gray commissure. So this is just meaning the common gray area. In that common gray area, we have a little hole. This is called our central canal, which you've seen before in bone tissue. That's right, kids. Central canal, reusing terms. Okay? Coming off of both our anterior and our posterior horns, we can see the beginnings of our roots. So on the dorsal side, we have our dorsal roots, and on our ventral side, we have our ventral roots, okay? Those roots are gonna come off of that spinal column, okay? And we're gonna see that enlargement that we could see on the cadaver on the dorsal side. It's called the dorsal root ganglion. Okay, on the cadaver, you could see that that bit was bigger. There's literally just an enlargement of some nerve cells there, along with these roots coming out that make it so big, versus the anterior root side. At this point on the model, what's really cool is those roots come together. Why is that important? Well, there's sort of a division of duties. What we have happening is that on the dorsal side, these roots are responsible for all of our sensory functions, okay? So they're gonna be sensory information coming into our spinal column. And on the ventral side, these roots are gonna be responsible for motor information going out. So at this point, we have a separation of duties. They come together here after that ganglion. And then what's really cool is they branch off, which of course we can't see on this model, into something called rami. We still see that we have a ventral and a posterior rami, but now what's happened is since they came together, we have mixed functioning in both of those rami, which is really important because as these nerves continue to go out to our appendages, we obviously want to have mixed sensory and motor function. So they're mixed at this point. The last thing that we can see on here, which I sort of skipped over, is we have special names for our white matter in addition to that gray matter. So if we've already figured out this is our ventral side, this is our dorsal side, We can kind of imagine how those gray area, those wings, would divide our white matter. We'd end up with something that looks kind of like a ventral or an anterior column. We'd end up with something called a posterior or a dorsal column, and would have sort of these lateral columns of white matter. Again, imagining if you're projecting this spinal column up, it would actually be a column of white matter. That's it.
Cool. Awesome. That was great.